you a friend of hers?
Oh, I'm sorry.
What on earth could have happened? Why would she do a thing like that?
To tell you the truth, I'm not a friend of hers at all. I hardly know her, actually, but...
Simone, you do recognize me, don't you? It's me, Stella. Your friend, Stella. Don't you recognize me?
We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the Doones to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to the Anadromist. This is Byrne Power, and as you can tell from the title of this video, I'm going to talk about why horror interests me. Horror fiction, horror movies, horror comic books, horror in general as a genre. I don't have any notes, and one of the questions I often get is, why do you like horror, Byrne? I get two questions frequently. One is, what's the whole thing with the puppets? A lot of people think that's somehow funny. If you watch the video that's either coming or you may have seen it somewhere else, my lecture about puppetry and the 21st century, then you should have a good understanding of why I like puppets. But horror is harder for people to understand. I've had these questions often posed by well-meaning people, Christians, New Agers, people who like soft, cuddly things. You know, why do you like horror, Byrne? And I've had some people say to me things like, you know, are you worried about the demons getting into you? Which I don't dismiss as a question out of hand. It would be easy to do that, but I think they're trying to express a concern, and they're also expressing the fact that they themselves have a great deal of difficulty in dealing with the kinds of images I deal with regularly. So, we're going to deal with that, but before we do, hey, like this video, share it, subscribe to the channel. All these things will help. I haven't had... my channel doesn't grow really rapidly. I think I'm all over the place. I know exactly what I can do to grow the channel, but every time I think about doing it, I don't want to, and that is split it up, just put the big series on one channel, and then put the interviews and all the other random subjects here. And yet, it's all one thing to me, so let's keep it one thing. And you can, therefore, since I'm not making a lot of money on this channel, subscribe and contribute to the channel. There is a link below and special instructions about how you could get audio extras. So we'll leave that there. Let's go on. Again, like I said, this is not going to be a long video, but it's just going to explain why I genuinely like horror films. Not all of them. There's a lot of crap, obviously. But I do get people who and I've had it in the last couple of videos I've done that had any sort of horror theme. Most recently, the video I made discussing Megan, which if you like horror films, you should go check that out. But I think my reasons for liking horror film are different than the average horror fan. As I have explained in another video, I'm not a fan of anything. Because fan to me always suggests fanatic, and I'm not fanatical about any work of humanity. I may occasionally slip and say, oh, I'm not, I may use the word, but I don't mean it the way most people mean it. So it's not like I have attended, back in the 1980s, I attended one horror convention, which was interesting. It was in Providence, Rhode Island, which is a good horror city because that's the home of H.P. Lovecraft. Or was. But let me go back. Let me start at the beginning. Did I like horror when I was a young kid? Well, my family was chaotic. It was just my mother and I, and then the occasional man she would bring into the family, usually through marriage. And because back in those days, you didn't just find another boyfriend right away or anything like that. You needed a bit of a commitment. Unfortunately, we've moved way beyond that now. And you can't even trust if a person says, I will love you for the rest of my life, that they will do anything remotely like that. Because for most people, the self comes first. But I remember, I think I was around 8 years old. We just moved from Hawaii to California. And I had seen like Godzilla and King Kong movies on, small, blurry black and white television with bad reception. And what I decided, what I was doing was I was drawing little pictures of like Godzilla or a big monster breaking down walls and things, like coming to you. And as I look back on it, I think this was a particularly troubled period in my life because the stepfather there was father, stepfather 1, and stepfather 2 was a real serious alcoholic. My mother tried to leave him and kept going back to him during this period after he moved us to California, the San Francisco Bay Area. But my mother used to say things to me like, she would always read like magazine articles and stuff, and she would say things like, Byrne, they say, it was always they, she never quoted anybody, they say that if you're drawing monsters and such, it means you're troubled. Now, if it was me now, I would just turn and go, you think? At that time, I was just like, I know what kind of answer do you have for that when you're 8 years old? Can we leave finally the man behind who's been chasing us from house to house? Do you think there's a connection here? I wonder. Anyway, I remember around that period watching like afternoon horror films on television. It was like 1930s stuff, sometimes 1950s stuff, nothing particularly gruesome except for The Monster of Pietrus Blancas. Look that one up. But I think at that point I got really interested in Famous Monsters of Filmland, which was a magazine. And so I started getting these in the mail. And it was always a real special day when the Famous Monsters came in the mail. I miss that now. The internet just totally ruins the effect of things coming to you in the mail. Except, of course, your Amazon shipments, which I do get some nice ones. All the way out here in Tbilisi, Georgia, across the waters from my American pseudo address. But I remember one day I got a magazine with a cover, and on the cover was a painting, an illustration from what I learned later would be one of the two titles was The Horror Hotel, and there's another title, it was a Christopher Lee movie. I never saw the movie, but this picture of this like decaying woman witch on the cover really freaked me out. I couldn't look at it anymore, and after that I stopped ordering Famous Monsters of Filmland just because I was afraid of it. A little later, I was also at that time just starting to get into comic books a bit. It lasted a few years. And there was the magazine Creepy, which was put out by the same people as Famous Monsters. And they had started putting out comic books that were a bit like EC Comics in the 1950s, which I would later find out are the horror comics. I have yet to see any comics produced since then that are anywhere near as intensely grotesque in the most incredible ways as EC comics from the 1950s. I mean, you can show me whatever you want. They might be gorier, more grotesque, but they don't do what EC comics did. Anyway, Creepy Magazine, nice name, and using the word in its literal sense, meaning not some weird guy who's trying to, hook you up for a date or an old doll or something, but meaning flesh crawling, which is what creepy means when applied to people. They had this one story in the first issue, and it was about a zombie. Now, this was the old school zombie, the kind that you get turned into one in Haiti. And it was just this weird woman. Her hands were outstretched. She had a small head, much smaller than she was supposed to. Now, this was all just, tropical fantasia. But the small head with the sewn-up lips on this full-size, beautiful torso. She was a beautiful woman in the cartoon. And she's just calling out, I remember the guy's name, Frank. That really freaked me out. Now, you'll notice two things here at once. That the things that freaked me out were images of deformed, decayed women. Why? Not sure. Did it relate to my mother? Not sure. No idea. Or maybe it was the sense that somehow the maternal love was getting misplaced somehow. I don't know what it was. But I know I stopped at that point having anything to do with horror. And then I started getting into rock music. And I started developing a rock collection. So you can see two of my favorite subjects here kind of colliding. Rock, in a sense, was the answer to the dread and fear I was facing in these comic books and magazines, and horror movies were getting, as they were bringing the newer horror films onto afternoon television for the kids. Like The Tingler, which eventually showed up, is a pretty intense, weird little film if you think about it as a 10-year-old. And I think that I wanted to push aside. I didn't have any answer. I didn't know why these things were so frightening. Nor did I tell anybody. I didn't tell my mother this frightened me or anything. I just stopped dealing with it. And I happened to be at a time when the music was really starting to change. And so I really got interested in the music. And this was the late 60s. And then eventually that started to feel like a betrayal as well. One thing I've learned in life is that everything will eventually feel like a betrayal, even the best things and even the best people. You stick around long enough, you'll see the holes. And that includes in me, that includes in you, that includes in various places, even the church, unfortunately. You will start to see the cracks caused by us, not by God, obviously. So, but then I became a Christian when I was 15, part of the Jesus movement, and this set up a paradigm for my life, which literally has never changed since then. I mean, it's changed in terms of discovering the dark parts of it and all of that, but it's never changed as far as I didn't go through any period of disappointment with it, because I spent the first years of my life, the first 15 years of my life, living in a meaningless manner anyway, and dealing with stepfathers and alcoholism and running away from people. And it was the kind of thing, I didn't need anyone to tell me that there was a problem with humanity. Later, it never occurred to me that there was, I've never understood the idea, how could God let such and such happen? Because I understood, that's just part of living in this world. That we have our choices, and one person's choice affects another. And sometimes, some little corporal in the army in World War I gets a fantasy about power and how to change the world. He gets close to the levers of control and changes the world. And nobody wanted that. But his choice outweighed all these other people's choice. Well, like I said, eventually I started to see the aspects of this Jesus People group that I was a part of. And there were certain things that we were changing in, and we were taking on cultish aspects. And so I was about 22 years old or so, and 21, 22. Now, believe it or not, from the age of, 12, maybe 11, 12 to 22, so that's at least a full 10 years. The only horror film I watched in that entire time, and that was kind of a group excursion together, was The Omen in the theaters, because we heard it, it had biblical, and the story's not biblical at all, but biblical themes, shall you say, about the last times and stuff. Pretty good film. But I'd never seen all the great horror films of the 1970s. I hadn't seen nearly as many of the classic ones from the 30s, 40s, 50s. Never saw anything from the 1920s from Germany, the silent films that were so great. Never saw any of that stuff. Except, like I said, for the stuff that showed up on television on the small screen. And then, it was 1977. I've gone into what that year was like for me in other places, so I'm not going to... the point of this is not to talk about my life. The point of this is to talk about horror films. 1977, I started to say, I need to understand what's happening in the culture. It's changing. And we, this group, were not understanding the changes. So, one of the things I did is I started smuggling in punk rock records. And that really kind of like got my mind going, because I said, why is this so different from the hippie music that I remember when I was younger? What's changed? And that set my brain like ticking away. Then I started realizing that there was something going on with the horror films in the 1970s. I had started to subscribe to Film Comment magazine to understand what was happening in the cinema. A lot of this came from my experience watching Taxi Driver, which is in itself a kind of horror film. And I explained that in my anecdotes video about my experiences at movie theaters. But then there came this point, and I remember there was this great theater, repertory theater in Petaluma, California. They'd taken over an old adult theater, which prior to that had been a great place just to watch movies, an old theater house with a couple of stories in it. And they turned it into this repertory house where I saw so many of the important films for me. I think I saw Exorcist there. I saw a lot of great important films. But I remember reading Film Comment magazine, and there was an article by Robin Wood, who was the opposite of me in many ways, gay Marxist Freudian commentator. But reading him, it wasn't that... I mean, he was trying to talk about the return of the repressed and stuff, but I saw, he's talking about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre like this really matters. And he was spoiling the hell out of the plot. I've, ever since then, never cared if the plots were spoiled for me. Every now and then, yeah. But most of the time, no. Because to me, I don't go to movies to be surprised. I go to movies, if they're good, to take part in them. And that surprise factor only lasts the first time, with the exception of the horror film, the TV version from about 1988 of The Woman in Black. Not the Daniel Radcliffe version, but the TV version. I have a copy of it here. I found it on Blu-ray finally. I'd been watching an old VHS tape of it. I have watched that film about 5 or 6 times, and literally every time it completely creeps me out. And there are reasons why that is so. Guess what? It's the old, deranged woman again. So I said, and I saw they had a double bill of The Hills Have Eyes, Wes Craven's movie, with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre at the Plaza Theater. So I got in line, and I'm waiting in line, and there's just this sense of like, ooh, we're going to see the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 1970. What year was it? I think it was 79, end of 79. And I'd gone to Labrie already and come back. My brain was like working like really well. It's like, we have to understand this stuff now. But I remember standing in line, and I was alone because I could never find anyone to go with me. Eventually, I brought some of my friends to go see Eraserhead as a midnight show, and they were all complete, it was just like, what have you done to us, Byrne? What was that? One friend said, well, I guess I won't be having any nightmares. I just had one, But I remember watching it, and suddenly, as I was watching it, we first watched The Hills Have Eyes. And they're both very similar. It's like, primitive, feral people out in the backcountry, kind of taking it out on the more suburban, in the case of The Hills Have Eyes, cool, hippie-type people in the case of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but it was certainly a revenge, But I was just, I remember in the middle there was an intermission between the two films, and my brain was just working overtimes on the movie. There was what was it? There was two dogs, one named Beauty and the other named Beast. Do I have to tell you which one died before the end and which one survived? No, I don't, because we know it's a horror film. There was a mirroring effect of the families and such. And I was thinking about all these things. My brain was, like I said, exploding with ideas. And ever since then, by the way, I've always looked at horror films as the most philosophical of all genres. Yeah, there is this visceral aspect that starts off, but as Stephen King once said, you want the visceral part that makes you go, ugh. The thing that makes you afraid, the thing that makes you react, to be there. But when someone comes back and thinks about it, you want there to be something more. And I think in the best horror fiction of all styles, there is something. And then came the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I've discussed that in that other video, my anecdotes number 2 on movie theater experiences. Did I discuss that? I should have. Anyway, the point is this. My brain exploded with ideas watching that. And I realized, oh my goodness, this is one of these key things between the hippie movement and the failure of it, which I could see with my own eyes because I was living in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so many of the people I had met wandering into the Jesus movement were refugees from the failure of the hippie movement. And then, so the optimism, even our optimism, kind of died. And then the punk rock came with its nihilism. And in between, chopping up the, as Joe Bob Briggs says, chopping up the teenage pork chops, in a Spam in a Cabin plot, is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And there's other films like Last House on the Left, another Wes Craven one, which most people can't stomach. But Tobe Hooper's Texas Chainsaw Massacre is an incredible piece of work. And over the years, it has stood up. And when I show it to younger people, which I have done a couple of times, no matter what age, they think they're cool. I show them the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and their teeth are like, ugh, because it's not that bloody. It's just the implications of it. And also the fact that the chainsaw is coming for you, oh hip young thing. You will not survive it. And in a sense, I started to see that progress was over. And this film was an announcement of progress being over, as many other things were in the late 1970s. And I discussed that much more thoroughly in my How We Got Here, the late 70s episode. So, it was in the 80s that I started paying much more attention to horror films. I did go to I saw a lot of stuff at rundown little movie theaters in Brooklyn and in what they call grindhouses, just running 2-3 films all day, and on 42nd Street around the corner from Times Square. And again, I've discussed my experiences in these places in the Anecdotes movie experience video. But what really stuck with me was the fact that these things really seemed to mean something. Now, it was around this period also, when I first got to New York, that people began to say, Byrne, what's this whole thing with you and horror films? Like, Byrne, maybe you should stop drinking. Byrne, maybe you shouldn't do heroin. It was kind of like that. It's like, Byrne, are you having a problem? To which my answer was, no, but you probably are, because you may have problems dealing with the things in this world that are dark, because that is what horror films are. And good old Stephen King, back in the days before he had to weigh in too heavily with his kind of they used to be more center or leftist positions. Now he's just, whatever it is that they do on that center right side and all the rest of that, I'm not into it. So he spouts off his Twitter opinions. And a lot of them are just not that interesting anymore. But back in the 80s, at one point he did an essay, and it's in the book Danse Macabre. And he talks about what is it about horror films. And he says it's the slowing down, passing an auto accident, looking, because you have to. Why do you have to look? Because as the medieval story of the 3 dead and the 3 livings goes, the 3 living think they're going to live forever, but the 3 dead say, such will you be. And the 3 dead are essentially 3, what we might call The Walking Dead, zombies today. So I think that, for me, horror has always had this aspect of staring death in the face. And I've certainly met a lot of people who said, well, Byrne, I know the world is dark, I don't need that. To which I respond, fine. If you really know that, you don't need it. I would never tell someone who's returned from the war, in any war, that you need to watch horror films. I would never tell anyone who's suffered with traumas in their life, you need to watch horror films. I would never tell someone who's been a victim of crime, you need to watch horror films. I would not be surprised if those kinds of people do watch horror films. Because, like I say, the horror film makes you think about the nature of the darker side of the fence. And as a Christian, I always found it interesting. Back in the 1980s, the white, kind of suburban, middle-class New York Christians would never dream of going to horror films. I was just like outside of the thing. But I'd meet black Christians in New York City who, when I mentioned Texas Chainsaw Massacre, they looked at me and said, amen, brother. And they were serious. This was an important film to them. They understood. And this was never made more clear to me than the time I looked out of my window when I lived on Clinton Street in the Lower East Side. And right below me, there was a car, and the police were going to pull a dead body out of it. And they put the police tape out there, and there was a collection of black and Hispanic folks all watching, waiting to see what the body was going to look like. And every time a white person came around the corner, someone who was like me, they would stop, realize what was going to happen, and make sure they didn't, there was no people in that crowd who were white. If I was there, I would have been standing there. But I had a better view than all of them because I was looking directly down on the car, which was right below me. And I watched. And when they pulled a man out of a car with a hole like this big out of the side of his head, because that's what a bullet does to you, the people down on the street, I was 1 floor up only, and the funk, the smell, but the people down in the street, like there's Dominican guys going like, what's it look like, man? And I said like, whoa, and they go, oh, my mamma mia, just incredible, they understood that this was what life could be. and their life could be if they didn't watch out. This was a lesson for them. Just as if you attend an amusement park in the right spirit, and the right spirit is never Disney. The right spirit, I mean, my most incredible roller coaster ride was in Coney Island on the Mouse, the Wild Mouse, I think it was called, and at night. And it was a wooden roller coaster.
Here we go. You ready for this one? Johnny! What's up? Take a gotta get a video Catch this one off.
And you went up, and then the lights disappeared. I mean, forget Space Mountain. The creaking of the wood, the drop straight into the blackness, that was it. And I love that because the roller coaster is essentially a metonym for the horror film, or the horror film is a metonym for the roller coaster. Each one makes us ask questions about the meaning of life. They are symbolic images that make you ask questions. Now, horror films make you ask a lot more questions. One of the genres that has been quite popular may not be the right word, relevant, and certainly among the horror aficionados of the 21st century, one of the genres that has really kind of grown is body horror, which I think is really fascinating for several reasons. One, what is this thing we call a body? And we are being tempted to remove ourselves from it by the internet, to pretend as if the body doesn't matter because I can just put myself, into the online world. And guess what? There are horror films about that too, which is why I talked about Megan earlier this year. It may not be the greatest horror film in the world, but timing-wise, whoa, AI. What does this all mean? What are we doing to ourselves? That's what horror films answer. There's so much more I could say about horror films, obviously. I know way too much. I'm not using any notes whatsoever. All this is in my head. And some of the things you're looking at as I'm talking, I'm just going to go through my some of the videos I have here. Yes, physical copies, and people who say, is that still a thing? Yeah, don't even talk to me. But here are some of the videos that I have sitting around here, and I'm not going to discuss them. I'm just showing you some of the covers so you know what I'm doing. I keep up with horror films. I don't watch every one. There are channels on YouTube, for instance, that I go to. Emma with Spooky Astronauts. Don't agree with her politically on a lot of stuff. But when it comes to someone who is fearless and will go out searching for what's new and what's happening, more than once, she has called my attention to something I really needed to pay attention to. And so I find people online who will point me to the films I should be watching now that reflect not just the fears of now, but the fears to come. And so coming soon, one of my theses is that the horror film in the 21st century is the best genre. It is the most important genre. A lot of people will say, yeah, the last 10 years have been great. And I go like, no. The whole 21st century. Ever since September 11th, ever since 1999 and Japanese horror, J-horror, kind of came on the scene. And, there's just been a wave of stuff. Now, a lot of people say, yeah, but what about all that gory stuff in the 21st century? You need to watch it. That's what I say. I mean, you may not have the stomach for it, but there's some really important stuff there. Even a film like Hostel really has an interesting message about the stupidity of Americans traveling to Europe who don't know anything about what they're looking for, being sucked into strange situations because Americans just live in their own bubble of America. But of course, Americans aren't the only ones to do that. But we are probably among the best at doing so, of remaining in our bubbles. If there are 2 Americans traveling, they're still in a bubble. If there's 3 Americans traveling, the outside world will never get in. It's and any group tour, no one's going to break that bubble, which is why Hostel was so great, because basically it showed, you're going to Amsterdam for the drugs and hookers, you idiot. And that's what you could say the whole point of the video was to say that. And if you watch it, and I don't know if you have the courage to, but if you watch it, you will see that that's the message of the film. It's that the myopia of Americans, and this was made during the time when we were, the Iraq War and our response to September 11th and all this stuff, and that's what all of those really bloody films were related to. It was this period of fear and suspicion. Did the fear and suspicion go away? Oh no, but it kind of shifted, and so did the horror films of the teens. You started getting more ghosts. You started getting more very eerie, unclassifiable horror stories. Hereditary by Ari Aster. It takes some moxie to watch that thing. And at the same time, I would say it's easily one of the best films of the 21st century. And actually, my favorite film of the 21st century, at least number 1 or 2, is Pascal Laugier's Martyrs. Not the American remake, but the original French one from 2008. Wow. I'm not even going to talk about it. But to me, that is an amazing film. And these films are also, and Martyrs is explicitly so, asking philosophical questions. So, to me, if you want to understand what's really happening in the 21st century, you watch horror films. Everything prior to that, is just, you're not getting the picture. The picture, these are subconscious fears come to life. And what they're telling us is, whoa, you better pay attention to what's happening, where we're going. And in one last thing I'll say before I go. A lot of people say, well, life is full of horrors. No. Interestingly, I'm living in a country, Georgia, which doesn't really even tell ghost stories. There's very little here that's horrifying. Because the history has been so intense here. So Georgians, for instance, don't do what Americans do when life gets tough. What Americans do is say, how could this happen? What Georgians do, like during the pandemic, or, if Russia started to attack or whatever, Georgians go like, okay, well, let's hunker down, here we go again. Life is difficult. And it's not a surprise. So they don't need horror films here. But I think that in my life, because I have watched horror films, I'm not really surprised when terrible things happen. So, when I watched the police fishing the man on a hot June day out of a car with the funk of death spreading across the streets, I was hardly surprised. When I was driving down the road in Alaska with a van full of 14 tourists, and one of the wheels just suddenly shredded, sending me in 2 possible directions. 1, into the side of a cliff coming down, and 2, into a river. I didn't freak out. I just simply said, this is now. Now is different than 5 minutes ago. Now is now. And we're here. We're not there anymore. We're here. But I get that from having rehearsed in my mind so many dangers that I know the world is filled with them. And I don't shut my eyes as I'm walking down the street to them. I don't try to stay in that good place. Because Jesus didn't try to stay in that good place. And in fact, you can look at the whole story of Christ on the cross as a horror story. That's what Mel Gibson did with The Passion of the Christ. And finally, where the rubber really meets the road, I was with my mother the final week of her life, watched her go crazy, watched her die without a hospital, with no, she wanted to die. She just didn't want to eat anymore. There was nothing I could do. And she went crazy, and she became exactly the image I was afraid of as a child. But you know what? I was a good son. I was prepared. And that's what a good horror films prepare you for the dark. And so for me, when the dark comes, you roll with it. That's why I like horror films. Plus, they're really cool. Some of them are great. And some of them are total shit. But hey, everyone can't be Hereditary, The Exorcist, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Silence of the Lambs, Nosferatu from 21, 22. Not every film can be great. And there's a lot of crap everywhere. But I do know the difference. So, all right, so I'm out of here. And someday, if you want it, I will give my real kind of hunker down and show you why the horror films of the 21st century are some of the best products of this time. Much better than the music. Much better than the big budget spectacular films. Much better than, unfortunately, way too much fiction, which has turned into kind of a psychological hole. So, all right, from Georgia, Drobit, we will meet again. And yeah, I'll just leave it there. By the way, I think I've got 10 of the 12 or 13 people signed up for a gathering in Georgia. Go back and watch one of those videos if you're interested. This isn't going to last long. So once it fills up, it's done. Think about it. See you later. Nakwamdis.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.
Clytemnestra is driven by revenge, just like the rest of Peter! Peter, what's wrong? Peter, are you all right?
Can you breathe?
Peter, what are you doing here?